Welcome to Starbound. If you're tired of AI-generated slop and want real, human storytelling, please subscribe and support this channel. My name is General G, and I'll be your narrator. Let's get into today's story. Balance was not a metaphor to a hell of a story, it was a physical constant. Gravity, momentum, friction. These were the reliable, quantifiable truths of the universe. So, when Kian Drogon, her human survey partner, offered a hand to help her across a moss-slicked cluster of rocks in the Mirren River, she regarded the gesture as an entirely superfluous and uncalibrated variable. Unnecessary. The word was as flat and even as a perfectly level surface. The Talasi maintained their own equilibrium. She placed her booted foot with an engineer's certainty onto a patch of dark, stable-looking stone, her own center of gravity adjusting with the seamless motion of a finely tuned machine. "Suit yourself." Kian was already on the other side, leaning against a tree that dripped with unfamiliar condensation, looking for all the world like a tourist. "Just don't blame me if you go for an unscheduled swim. Captain Mayvac would have my hide for getting the geosensors waterlogged." "The sensors are rated for full submersion at a depth of up to 50 meters, Ayala replied without looking at him. "Your concern is noted, but factually unsupported." A soft chuckle came from his direction. "You know, for a person who speaks in technical manuals, you've got a dry sense of humor." "Humor is an unnecessary variable. I am merely stating facts." She secured her footing on the final rock and hopped onto the muddy bank, her boots sinking slightly into the rich, loamy soil. She immediately began unspooling the filament for the next sensor node, her fingers deftly securing the connectors and sinking the anchor spike in a single fluid sequence. Work was the mission. Work was the purpose. "Hey, Ayala, hold up a sec. Check this out." The usual cheer had vanished from his voice, replaced by a note of caution. She looked up, her jaw tightening. He was crouched beside a gnarled tangle of roots near the water's edge, his easy smile gone. That alone was enough to make her pause. She walked over, the puzzle of the scene overriding her annoyance. On the ground lay the carcass of a low-slung hexapodal grazer native to Mir. It was fresh, too fresh. A thick, violet-hued discoloration marred the fur on its flank, centered on two tiny, clean puncture marks. "Glimmerfang," Kian said, pointing with a gloved finger but not getting any closer. "Nasty little buggers. Saw one last week. Looked like a ribbon of emerald glass weaving in the water's current." Ayala knelt without hesitation, pulling a scanner from her belt. The risk was minimal. The creature was deceased. She ran the device over the wound, tracking the readings as they scrolled across the display. "Interesting," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Interesting?" Kian echoed, standing up and taking a cautious step back from the water. "Ayala, that thing's venom can necrotize a limb in minutes. Interesting isn't the word I'd use. Terrifying, maybe. Let's get the hell out of this riverbed, definitely." "The tissue's necrosis is highly localized," she clarified, absorbed by the stream of data. "The venom appears to have congealed in a viscous gel, instead of causing systemic failure, an ineffective delivery method. You would expect a fast-acting neurotoxin to disperse rapidly through the bloodstream for maximum effectiveness." She tapped the scanner, saving the anomalous data. A puzzle. Ayala Vasori lived for a good, clean, quantifiable puzzle. "Right, ineffective." Kian scrubbed a hand over his face, his gaze still scanning the murky water. "Well, its ineffectiveness was still 100% effective on that poor guy. Let's be extra careful." "Caution is a baseline procedure," Ayala stated, rising and meticulously wiping her scanner clean before stowing it. She turned back to her sensor grid. The dead creature, while a valuable data point, was a distraction from her primary objective. Kian followed her, his boots squelching in the mud. "Do you have rivers like this back on Talos?" The question was so out of context, so personal, it took her a moment to process. "Talos has fluvial systems, yes. They are defined primarily by their sediment load and discharge rates, which are dictated by our planet's higher gravitational pull and denser atmospheric conditions. They bear little resemblance to this one. There was a pause. The ambient hum and chirp of the Mirren jungle seemed to retreat. She felt his gaze on her, an uncalibrated pressure she couldn't measure. "Right," she finally said, her voice softer than before. "Sediment load. Got it." He turned away and went back to prepping his own set of sensors. For the first time since they landed on this moon, the quiet, melodic humming he usually filled the space with was absent. The silence he left behind felt oddly, illogically, loud. The universe, Ayala had always believed with unwavering certainty, operated on a set of inviolable physical laws. An object in motion stays in motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. A foot placed with scientific confidence onto a submerged, moss-covered surface that writhes will slip. The thing beneath her boot twisted with shocking muscular power. A flash of emerald green, shockingly fast, and then a sensation like two superheated needles punching through the reinforced fabric of her suit and sinking deep into the flesh of her calf. The pain was a hostile rewiring of her body's internal code, a violation of her very cells. A sharp guttural cry was torn from her throat, a sound she had never made before, utterly foreign to her own ears. Her leg gave out from a sudden, terrifying numbness that was already spreading from the puncture site like a pool of cryogenic fluid. She hit the ground hard. Her meticulously maintained equilibrium shattered into a million useless pieces. The world tilted, the vibrant greens and browns of the riverbank blurring into a meaningless smear of color. "Ayala!" Kian's voice, sharp with adrenaline, cut through the fog of agony. Strong hands were on her, dragging her away from the water's edge. His movements frantic but sure. He ripped a panel on his wrist, and a shrill, piercing emergency beacon began to pulse through the humid air. A frantic heartbeat in the sudden hush of the jungle. "Drogon, report!" The voice of Captain Mavic erupted from his comm unit, tinny and laced with static. "It's Ayala! She's been bitten! Glimmerfang!" Kian's fingers tore at the tough fabric of her trousers, exposing the wound. The two small punctures were already ringed with an ugly, deepening violet that seemed to spread even as he watched. He slapped a biomonitor from the medkit onto her wrist. The device immediately shrieked a high-pitched, continuous alarm. "Acknowledged, Drogon." Mavic's voice was tight. "Dr. Helene is on the channel. Stand by." A new voice joined the cacophony. A calm, dispassionate monotone Ayala recognized with a sinking sense of dread. It was the ship's Talasi medical officer, a voice that promised logic but no comfort. Kian Drogon applied the broad-spectrum stasis agent to the wound site immediately. "I'm trying!" Kian grunted, his hands shaking slightly as he pressed the applicator to her leg. "The field is failing to form!" Ayala could feel it, or rather, the lack of it. The stasis agent was supposed to create a localized field, freezing the tissue and the toxin within it. But this was different. The numbness was still spreading, a cold tide rising unstoppably up her leg. Her vision was starting to tunnel, the edges fraying into black. Dr. Helene's voice returned, as empty of emotion as a vacuum. "The biomonitor confirms. The Venom has biomimetic properties. It is fooling the nanites. The stasis agent is failing to isolate it. There is no synthesized anti-venom for this species on board the breaker. I am sorry." Sorry. The word was a pebble dropped into the vast, silent ocean of her impending non-existence. Mavac cut through Helene's clinical pronouncement like a plasma torch. "Shuttle is prepping, Drogon. We're burning the engines hot. ETA is 6 minutes. You have to keep her alive for 6 minutes. Do you understand me?" 6 minutes. An eternity. A blink. Ayala's head lolled to the side. She could see the high canopy of the alien trees, a complex lacework of green against a pale, indifferent sky. It was, she noted with a detached part of her mind, a statistically acceptable final image. She closed her eyes, preparing for the logical, inevitable. Conclusion. Kian stared at Ayala's face. Her skin, usually a warm tan, was taking on a grayish waxy sheen. Her breathing was a shallow, barely perceptible flutter. 6 minutes. He glanced at the screaming bio-monitor on her wrist. The numbers were plummeting like a stone in a well. "Make her comfortable, Mr. Drogon," Dr. Haleen instructed from the comms. "There is nothing more that procedure can do for her now." Procedure is a dying word, Kian thought, a wave of cold fury washing over him. He looked from her still face to the horrifyingly inert wound on her calf. The viscous gel, the localized necrosis, an ineffective delivery method. Ayala's own words, her own brilliant logical observation echoed in his head. Ineffective because it didn't spread fast enough. It congealed. It stayed near the surface. He pulled his field knife from its sheath. The polished metal glinted in the dappled sunlight. "Drogon, what are you doing?" Mavik's voice cracked with alarm over the comms. "Talk to me!" Kian ignored her. He didn't have time for explanations, logic, or regulations. He only had time for a desperate, insane, ancient long shot. He leaned close to Ayala, his face just inches from hers. Her eyes were closed, but he whispered her name anyway, a prayer sent into the uncaring jungle. "Ayala." He held her leg steady with one hand, and with the other, he made a small, shallow incision with the tip of his knife, a thin red line connecting the two dark fang marks. Then he took a deep breath, lowered his head, and sealed his mouth over the wound. A wet, ragged sound of desperate suction echoed over the open comm channel. On the bridge of the breaker, a stunned, horrified silence fell, broken only by a junior officer's gasp. Dr. Heleen's voice, for the first time laced with something other than clinical detachment, cut through the silence. It was a strained, incredulous statement of fact. "Negative, Drogon, cease. That is an unsanctioned procedure. He is attempting oral suction. Probability of pathogen cross-contamination is 93%. Kian's world narrowed to the coppery, metallic taste of Ayala's blood and the vile chemical bitterness of the venom. He kept his mouth sealed tight around the wound, sucking hard, his cheek muscles screaming. He pulled back, turned his head, and spat a thick, viscous mouthful of dark violet blood and translucent, quivering gel onto the grass. The substance sizzled faintly as it touched the green blades, melting them into black sludge. He went back again, the chilling numbness of the toxin already beginning to deaden his tongue, and the inside of his lips. He could feel it trying to creep down his throat. He sucked, spat, and sucked again. Ayala's body, which had gone limp, gave a sudden shuddering twitch. A low, wounded groan escaped her lips. It was the most beautiful sound Kian had ever heard. On the bridge of the breaker, the junior officer, his eyes wide and glued to his console, yelled, his voice cracking, "Captain, her vitals, respiratory rate, it's stabilizing. Blood oxygenation is climbing." Kian knew this was a gamble, a delay, a desperate chance. It was 6 minutes. The deafening, ground-shaking roar of shuttle engines tore through the air, the downdraft whipping leaves into a frenzy. Just as two figures in med-gear burst from the shuttle's lowered ramp, the last of Kian's adrenaline deserted him. A wave of nausea rolled through him. He slumped to the ground beside Ayala, his mouth and throat on fire, the world spinning. He had bought the time. He could only hope it was enough. Ayala's first sensation upon waking was not relief or pain. It was a profound, full-body mortification that burned hotter than any fever. She was in the med bay. The air smelled of sterile cleansers. Her leg was bandaged, a faint throbbing emanating from her calf. Across the brightly lit room in the next bio-bed was Kian Drogon, and he was smiling at her, a tired, sheepish, utterly catastrophic smile. Ayala wanted to close her eyes and instruct her consciousness to cease operations. "Ah, Ayala Vasori, you are awake. Excellent." Dr. Heleen's dry monotone cut through her internal crisis. He stood by her bed, holding a data slate. "Your recovery is proceeding at a rate that exceeds initial projections by 37.2%. The residual toxin was neutralized with a target nanite flush once we were able to sequence its unique protein structure." He paused, tapping his slate. It is my duty to inform you that Kian Drogon's intervention was the decisive factor in your survival." Helene looked up, a gleam of academic zeal briefly animating his otherwise impassive face. "Our analysis confirms your field observation. The venom molecules are usually large and viscous, encased in a complex biomimetic protein shell. Our stasis nanites identified the shell as native biological material and failed to target the payload within. Logically, it should have been fatal. However, his crude suction method physically removed the bulk of the congealed, unabsorbed toxin from the surface tissues. The data is fascinating." Ayala's gaze flickered back to Kian. A medical drone hovered near his head, emitting a low hum as it directed a pale blue light into his open mouth. He winced, clearly having his mouth and throat treated. He caught her eye, and the wince turned into that same infuriating, gentle smile. He had poisoned himself for her. He had performed an act of such primal, unhygienic intimacy that her Talassi mind struggled to categorize it. It had no file, no schematic. It was just a gaping hole in her understanding of the universe. She wanted to vaporize. With a surge of will, Ayala pushed herself into a sitting position, her back rigid. The thin medbay gown felt like a shroud of public humiliation. She fixed her gaze on Kian. "Kian Drogon," she said, her voice formal and strained. "I owe you a life debt." Kian's smile faltered. The medical drone retracted its light and zipped away. "Whoa, Ayala, hey, no, it's okay, really." "That is unacceptable," she insisted. "A life was saved. A debt has been incurred. According to the tenets of my culture, it must be balanced. It is a fundamental principle of societal equilibrium. I will transfer to you a sum of credits equivalent to the projected lifetime earnings of a Talassi Class 3 Geosystems engineer. It is a substantial and logically appropriate figure." Kian stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked like hurt. He swung his legs over the side of his biobed. "Ayala, no, absolutely not. We're a team. That's what teammates do for each other. You don't owe me anything." She stared back, baffled. His refusal was a wrench in the gears of her entire worldview. "Your refusal is incompatible with the established facts," she said, the words coming out tight as a stressed hull plate. "A debt must be balanced. An unbalanced ledger creates a state of profound dissonance. It is an unresolved equation." "Well, then it'll have to stay unresolved," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "I don't want your money, Ayala. I just want you to be okay. That's all." "Mr. Drogon," an orderly called from the doorway, "Dr. Helene needs you for a follow-up endoscopy to ensure there's no residual esophageal damage." Kian grimaced but stood up. He gave her one last long, unreadable look before he turned and followed the orderly out. Ayala was left alone, faced with an unsolvable variable in her life's most critical equation. The next day they were summoned. Captain Mavik's office was spare and functional, the only decoration a framed antique chart of Earth's system behind her desk. She sat behind her metal desk, her hands steepled, her expression as grim as asteroid iron. Ayala and Kian stood before her. "Kian Drogon," Mavik began, her voice low. She slid a data slate across the desk. "This is a formal commendation for extreme bravery and decisive action. Your quick thinking, however unorthodox, directly resulted in the saving of Ayala Vasori's life. It will be entered into your permanent service record. Congratulations." Kian blinked. Thank you, Captain." Mavik's expression hardened. "Furthermore," she continued, her tone dropping, "you are being formally reprimanded." She slid a second slate across the desk. "Gross insubordination, direct violation of a medical officer's order, and a flagrant breach of quarantine procedure. You put yourself at extreme risk, and you are lucky, Kian, incredibly lucky." She leaned forward. "You got lucky the venom was weird. You got lucky you didn't get a fatal dose. You got lucky you didn't introduce a dozen types of Terran mouth bacteria into an open wound and kill her with a secondary infection. The commendation is for the log because you saved a life. The reprimand is for the log, because you broke every damn rule to do it." She sat back. "The matter is closed, but know this." Her eyes shifted from Kian to Ayala, lingering for a moment with a look that was part warning, part exhaustion. "Don't you ever make me choose between my crew and my rulebook like that again." Dismissed. They walked out in a shared silence. The commendation was an accusation, the reprimand a validation of his recklessness, and the debt Ayala owed him suddenly felt like a knot in her gut, a thorny, intricate problem without a solution. The following week, Ayala was restricted to light duty. The ship, a marvel of design, had never felt so small. The mess hall became a social minefield. Beck, the burly, good-natured pilot, clapped Kian on the shoulder one evening, his voice booming. "There he is, the crazy snake-sucking hero of Mir. First round's on me, my man." Kian managed an embarrassed smile. Ayala, 3 tables away, felt a hot flush of shame crawl up her neck. It was worse when the comments were whispers she wasn't meant to hear. She overheard a junior botanist murmur to her friend, "Poor Ayala, can you imagine? So undignified. I think I'd rather just die." The casual pity in the woman's voice made Ayala's stomach clench, a direct challenge to the Talasi ideal of stoic self-sufficiency. Her survival had become sordid gossip. She began to watch Kian. Her assessment was no longer professional. It had become an investigation, an obsession. She saw him in the rec room, patiently explaining the arcane rules of an old Earth card game called poker to a homesick junior crewman. She saw him in the corridor, pausing to help a grizzled engineer carry a heavy plasma conduit. She was cataloging his behavior, trying to find the framework for his actions. Then she started noticing the small things, the way he would subtly rub his jaw, a faint grimace tightening his mouth, the way his hand would occasionally go to his throat, lingering effects of the acidic venom. A constant physical reminder of the price he had paid, the price he had refused to let her repay. The imbalance felt like a flaw in the fabric of reality, a crack in the foundation of her mind. The summons from Dr. Helene was unavoidable. He requested their presence for a formal debriefing for his research paper. Ayala had read the proposed title with a growing sense of dread. Anomalous Psychosomatic Survival Responses in Talisi Subjects Following Archaic Terran Intervention Rituals, a Case Study. The meeting was an exercise in clinical torture. Helene sat across a polished steel table, a recording device active between them. "Ayala Vasori," he began, "please describe the precise sensation of the envenomation." Ayala recounted it in clipped terms. "A high-velocity piercing event followed by a rapid onset localized paralysis and significant bioelectric disruption." "Fascinating," Helene murmured. "And your emotional state?" "My emotional state was irrelevant to the biological process." "An interesting hypothesis," Helene countered. "However, the data from your biomonitor suggests a spike in adrenaline and cortisol consistent with the Terran classification of fear. Did you experience this?" Before Ayala could respond, Kian spoke up. "She was in shock, Doc. She was dying. Anyone would be scared." Helene turned his placid gaze on Kian. "Kian Drogon, describe your decision-making process. At what point did you abandon medical procedure?" "When you told me she had 6 minutes to live," Kian said simply. "Procedure became irrelevant." "And where did you acquire the knowledge of this technique?" Kian hesitated. "I learned this on Earth. It's an old method from before all this." He gestured vaguely at the lab. The questions continued. Clinical, probing. Helene asked about the venom's texture, its taste, the effects on Kian's mouth. Then he turned back to Ayala. "Your biomonitor registered a secondary neurological event upon physical contact from Kian Drogon. Specifically during the application." He paused. "A significant spike in oxytocin and vasopressin. In Terrans, this is correlated with social bonding. In Talasi, such a response outside of procreative or familial contexts is undocumented." Can you describe your cognitive response to the unhygienic intervention? The word unhygienic landed like a slap. Ayala's composure threatened to snap. The intervention was unexpected. Kian cut in, his voice protective. Ayala was barely conscious. You can't expect a detailed cognitive analysis, Helene. Let's stick to the physical data. Helene looked from Kian's tense face to Ayala's rigid posture. Very well, though the psychological component is, in my opinion, the most fascinating variable. They sat there for another 20 minutes, two subjects in a bizarre experiment. The sterile setting, the clinical questions, the shared ordeal, it was forging something new between them, a strange, unwelcome but undeniable intimacy. After Kian was dismissed, Dr. Helene asked Ayala to remain. He had deactivated the recorder. Ayala Vasuri, he said, his voice carrying a new weight. We must speak logically. I am always logical, Doctor. Are you? His head tilted. This imbalance with the human, an unpaid life debt, it is a source of great psychological dissonance for our people. An equation with no solution. It can lead to a degradation of logic. Degradation of logic. To a Talasi, this was the ultimate horror. You have an unresolved variable of immense magnitude in your life equation, Ayala, Helene continued. Your body responded with a hormonal cascade we cannot explain. This is not a stable state. For the integrity of your mind, you must find a way to balance the ledger. Find a custom of his people, a method he will accept. You must resolve the anomaly. Her words, intended to help, felt like a cage closing around her. She had a cultural and psychological imperative. She had to solve the problem of Kian Drogon for her own sanity. Driven by Helene's chilling warning, Ayala retreated to her quarters. She had to approach this as an engineering problem. The input? Kian's act. Its core components: non-material, profoundly personal, life-saving, and inducing an anomalous response in her. Her conclusion was inescapable. A material repayment was illogical. The balancing of the ledger must therefore be non-material, personal, and acknowledge the intimacy of the original event. Her first search query, Terran Life Debt Customs, yielded only fiction. Frustrated, she tried a new path, a survey of human poetic works on gratitude. She selected an entry, Sonnet 18. After reading the first line, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" she closed the file. Comparison invalid, she noted aloud. A Terran day possesses chaotic meteorological patterns, a poor metric for value. Finally, she narrowed her search to anthropological texts, a subfile, a socio-biological analysis of non-procreative intimacy in pre-FTL human societies. It was filled with charts and statistical analyses. She paused on one entry, the kiss, osculation. It was a symbolic gesture with a wide range of meanings, but highly context-dependent. Then she saw it. A simple clinical diagram of two human heads, profiles facing each other, lips touching. It showed the primary muscles involved, the orbicularosaurus. Ayala stared at the diagram. It was a physical action with defined parameters. It could be observed, replicated, and executed. It was non-material, personal, and involved physical contact. It met the criteria. This was the solution. A gesture to acknowledge his actions in a controlled, symbolic, and, most importantly, logical way. A way to finally balance the ledger. She found him in the observatory. The only light came from the star-dusted velvet of space. Mir hung outside the main viewport, a giant marbled crescent of blue and white. Kian was standing near the curved glass, looking at a distant nebula, a splash of magenta and deep blue against the black. He was humming softly, his silhouette framed by ancient light. The tune was slow and haunting. For a moment, Ayala just stood in the arched doorway, listening. The sound wasn't distracting. Here, in the immense silence, it felt like a part of the view. She stepped in. "What is that song?" Kian started slightly. "Oh, hey, Ayala." He gestured toward the starfield. "Just getting some perspective." He paused. "It's an old sea shanty. a spacefaring version, the Asteroid Man." He turned back to the view. "It's about a lone prospector, lost out in the belt. Ship's dead, comms are down. He thinks he's done for. And then, another ship, a stranger, answers his emergency beacon and guides him home." The meaning of the words hung in the space between them. An emergency beacon, a stranger, a guide home. The old Ayala would have pointed out the inefficiency of song for data transfer. This Ayala did something new. She didn't try to fill the silence with logic. She just stood beside him, a few feet away, and watched the stars. The next day, she found him in the hydroponics bay. The air was warm, humid, and smelled of rich soil. He was humming again, something more upbeat. Ayala walked down the narrow aisle, her heart, a purely biological pump, she reminded herself, beating at an elevated rate. This was the most logical course of action, a public act to reframe the narrative. Her choice, an act of agency. "Kian Drogon," her voice was steady. He turned, a watering can in his hand, a welcoming smile on his face. The smile faltered at her serious expression. "Hey, Ayala, come to inspect the kale?" She did not smile back. "My research into an appropriate human custom to reciprocate a service for your magnitude has concluded." His smile vanished. "Ayala, we talked about this. You don't need to—" She held up a hand. It worked. "A material repayment would be illogical. It would not match the non-material nature of the event. The anthropological data suggests the correct response is a non-procreative symbolic gesture of gratitude and acknowledged intimacy." She took a steadying breath. "A kiss." Before Kian could process this declaration, she stepped forward. He stood there, holding the watering can. She placed her hands formally on his shoulders, a precise placement. She leaned in, tilted her head to the 30-degree angle from the schematic, and pressed her lips to his. It was brief, it was firm, it was technically perfect. The custom was executed, the ledger was balanced. She pulled back, her expression analytical, observing him for a reaction. Kian was frozen. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly agape. A slow, dark blush began to creep up his neck. The silence stretched. "Was my execution of the custom flawed?" she asked, her voice betraying a tiny tremor. Kian finally blinked. The frozen shock on his face melted away, replaced by a slow, brilliant, breathtaking smile that transformed his entire face. "No," he said, his voice a little shaky, a little hoarse. "No, Ayala, it was perfect." He set the watering can down with a soft thud. "But I think that's only half of it." He stepped forward, closing the formal gap between them. He gently took her face in his hands. His palms were warm and slightly calloused, and his touch sent a jolt of pure, unanalyzable data through her nervous system. "The other person," he whispered, his eyes searching hers, "they're supposed to participate. It's a team effort." And then he kissed her. His kiss was slow and soft and tasted faintly of the sweet air in the bay. It was a conversation without words, a story told in a single lingering touch that spoke of gratitude and relief and a deep aching tenderness. This gesture transcended repayment or the balancing of a ledger. It was a revelation. When he finally pulled away, Ayala's meticulously ordered mind was a whirlwind of new, wonderful, completely chaotic data. Beneath the crashing simulations, she was aware of a simple, quiet warmth spreading from her chest outward. An equation that didn't need solving, only feeling. He rested his forehead against hers. "I never, ever want to see you in that kind of danger again," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he was finally beginning to understand. "But I can't bring myself to regret what happened. Is that crazy?" Ayala Visori, lead geosystems engineer, considered his question. She ran the variables, the bite, the fear, the ridiculous, life-saving act, the shame, the debt, the research, the song, the conversation, the touch. 1,000 crashing simulations resolved into a single undeniable conclusion. A small, gentle smile touched her lips, her first. "Perhaps," she replied, her voice softer and warmer than he had ever heard it. "Logic was simply the wrong tool for this problem."